When we ask the question, who is they? Most people instinctively start looking outward, as if there is some shadowy group somewhere making decisions about our lives. But if we are honest, brutally honest, we realize very quickly that they is rarely a single person and almost never a clearly defined group. They is an idea. It is a voice. It is a narrative that floats around us until over time it settles inside us. And the danger of an idea is that it does not need permission to take residence in your heart or mind. They is what people say without thinking. It's the sentence that begins with, "You can't do that," or "People like us don't usually," or "That's not how the world works," no name attached. No credentials presented, just assumptions passed down like inherited furniture. Old, dusty, unquestioned. And because there is no clear face to challenge, they feels authoritative. It feels final. It feels bigger than you. What makes they so powerful is not that it is loud, but that it is familiar. You hear it growing up. You hear it in classrooms, in family gatherings, in casual jokes, in warnings disguised as concern. Over time, you stop hearing it as an external voice. It becomes internal. Now it sounds like wisdom. Now it sounds like realism. Now it sounds like you. And this is where the real problem begins. Because once they becomes an idea you carry, you stop needing external pressure. You police yourself. You lower your own expectations. You abandon dreams before anyone even criticizes them. You don't need chains when you've learned to sit still on your own. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Most of the time, they has no idea what they're talking about. They did not live your life. They did not walk your path. They did not measure your potential. In fact, if you traced most of these voices back far enough, you'd discover they were born out of fear, failure, or convenience, not truth. History teaches us this again and again. Every breakthrough was once unrealistic. Every reform was once dangerous. Every person who changed the world was warned by they to stay in their place. And had those individuals accepted that idea, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. So the first step is not rebellion. It is clarity before you fight they. You must unmask it. Ask the simple question, who exactly said this? Why do I believe it? And what happens if I don't? The moment you do this, they begins to shrink. Not because you became stronger overnight, but because illusions do not survive scrutiny. Because once you realize they is just an idea, you also realize ideas can be replaced. Once we understand that they is an idea and not a person, the next question naturally follows. How did that idea get so deep inside us in the first place? Because no one is born afraid of possibility. No child comes into this world already convinced that their dreams are unrealistic or that their voice doesn't matter. These beliefs are learned, absorbed, slowly installed over time, often by people who never intended harm. It begins early. As children, we are taught structure, rules, and limits, some of them necessary, many of them convenient. We are rewarded for compliance and corrected for curiosity. We learn very quickly what earns approval and what invites discomfort. So we adjust, not because we lack courage, but because belonging feels safer than standing alone. And this is how they finds its first opening. Then the circle expands. School systems teach us what success looks like in neat categories. You are good at this, not that. This path is respectable, that one is risky. Creativity is praised in theory but discouraged in practice. Failure is treated as something shameful rather than instructional. And quietly, without anyone ever saying it explicitly, the message settles in. Don't try too much. Don't question too far. Don't step outside the lines unless you're prepared to pay a price. As we grow older, culture takes over the role. Society has a way of defining value in narrow terms: status, income, recognition. We are shown highlight reels of success without the years of struggle behind them. Comparison becomes constant, and suddenly they sounds like statistics, trends, and social norms. People don't make it that way. Be realistic. Know your limits. All said with confidence, rarely with evidence. And then there is fear, dressed up as wisdom. Often it comes from people who love us. Parents who want security for their children. Friends who don't want to see us fail. Elders who speak from their own disappointments. Their intentions may be sincere, but fear has a way of transferring itself. So their caution becomes our ceiling. Over time, repetition does its work. The mind begins to confuse familiarity with truth. The more often you hear something, the more reasonable it feels, even if it was never proven, and eventually they no longer needs to speak out loud. You anticipate it. You silence yourself before anyone else does. You hesitate not because you can't move forward, but because you've been trained to pause. And this is why awareness matters so much. Because once you recognize the process, you stop blaming yourself. You realize this wasn't weakness. It was conditioning, and what is conditioned can be unlearned. The same mind that absorbed limits can absorb clarity. The same heart that learned fear can relearn trust. Because the moment you see how they got in, you also see the door it must now leave through. When they settles into your thinking and goes unchallenged, it doesn't announce its consequences right away. The cost is quiet, it's subtle, it shows up not as a dramatic failure, but as a life that slowly contracts. You don't wake up one morning and decide to abandon your potential. You simply stop reaching for it. And over time, what once felt possible begins to feel impractical, even irresponsible. The first thing that disappears is courage. Not because you no longer have it, but because you've been taught that courage is reckless. So you begin to confuse safety with wisdom. You choose the familiar path even when it leaves you restless. You convince yourself that comfort is contentment. And every time you ignore that inner discomfort, something inside you grows quieter. Then come the compromises. Small at first, you delay the goal, you lower the standard, you tell yourself maybe later, or this is good enough. None of these decisions feel catastrophic on their own, but together they shape a life lived under capacity. And the tragedy is not that you failed, it's that you never fully tried. Believing they also reshapes how you see yourself. You begin to identify with limitations instead of possibilities. You introduce yourself through what you are not. You define your life by constraints rather than convictions. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you start living defensively, protecting yourself from disappointment instead of positioning yourself for growth. There is also a spiritual cost. When you accept a narrative that tells you to stay small, you begin to doubt that your presence matters. You stop seeing your abilities as responsibility and start seeing them as inconvenience. You forget that being capable is not an accident, and that potential is not randomly distributed without purpose. And when that understanding fades, motivation turns into obligation and purpose into routine. Perhaps the greatest cost of all is regret. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the quiet kind that surfaces in moments of honesty. The what if that appears when life slows down. The awareness that you complied when you were meant to contribute. That you listened when you were meant to lead. That you survived when you were meant to build. And here's the painful irony. They rarely pay the price for the lives they limit. You do. The dreams that remain unexplored, the talents left unused, the impact never made. That weight is carried by the individual, not the idea that restricted them. They move on. You are the one who lives with the outcome, but recognizing this cost is not meant to paralyze you. It is meant to wake you up, because once you see what belief has taken from you, you can no longer pretend neutrality. Staying silent becomes a choice. Staying small becomes a decision, and the moment you realize what obedience has cost you is the moment you begin to reclaim what's still possible. Once you begin to see the cost of believing another uncomfortable realization follows. There are systems, habits, and structures that quietly benefit when people don't question the narrative, not because there is always some grand conspiracy, but because stability, especially unequal stability, relies on predictability. And predictable people are easier to manage than awakened ones. When individuals remain small in their thinking, systems remain large in their control. When people doubt themselves, they outsource decision making. When people are unsure of their worth, they accept whatever is handed to them. This isn't always malicious. Often it's simply efficient. A world that runs on routine needs people who won't disrupt the rhythm by asking inconvenient questions. You see this in workplaces where innovation is celebrated in slogans but discouraged in practice. You see it in social structures that reward conformity while labeling dissent as trouble. You see it in cultural expectations that quietly tell you when to speak, when to stay silent, and how far is too far. None of this requires force. It works precisely because most people comply willingly, believing they are being realistic rather than restricted. Fear plays a crucial role here. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood. And once fear is normalized, it becomes self-sustaining. People begin to enforce limits on one another. Warnings are passed down. Caution is praised as maturity. And anyone who steps outside the accepted boundaries is quickly reminded of the risk. Sometimes subtly, sometimes harshly. What makes this especially effective is that these systems rarely need to crush ambition outright. They only need to delay it, exhaust it, distract it, keep people busy enough surviving that they never have the space to imagine something better. When life becomes a cycle of maintenance, transformation feels like a luxury instead of a responsibility. And yet, the system's greatest advantage is not power. It's participation. It depends on people believing that the way things are is the way things must be. The moment enough individuals question that assumption, the structure begins to wobble. That is why curiosity is often discouraged and compliance is rewarded. Not because questioning is wrong, but because it is powerful. Still, it's important to say this clearly. The goal is not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Not chaos, not destruction. It is consciousness. It is awareness. Systems are not inherently evil, but they become dangerous when they go unquestioned. And people are not weak for adapting to them, but they are diminished when they never challenge them. The problem is not that systems exist. The problem is when they convince you that your role is fixed, your ceiling is permanent, and your voice is optional. Because the moment you accept that story, growth becomes disobedience, and purpose becomes disruptive. And no system built on small thinking can survive the presence of someone who has finally decided to think for themselves. Once you begin to question something remarkable happens. At first, it feels unsettling, almost dangerous, because for so long your life has been guided by invisible boundaries you didn't even realize existed. And yet, the moment you ask who exactly is they, a subtle shift occurs. The weight of unquestioned authority begins to lift, not because anyone removed it, but because your mind refuses to carry it any longer. Awareness is the first rebellion, and it is quiet yet profound. When you question you start noticing the gaps between what people say and what is true. You begin to see the assumptions that have been passed down, the fears that have been disguised as wisdom, and the rules that were never really about fairness or growth. And in those gaps, opportunity appears, The space that was once occupied by unquestioned limits now becomes a playground for imagination, for courage, for possibility. The world hasn't changed. Your perception has. This is where real freedom begins. It is not the kind of freedom that comes from permission or approval. It is the freedom that comes from clarity. Once you recognize that they is an idea, not an authority, you can start choosing differently. You can measure your decisions not by what is expected, but by what is meaningful. You can take risks not because you are reckless, but because you have finally realized that calculated courage is more valuable than quiet compliance. And the power of questioning they grows quickly. Because when one part of your mind refuses to obey unexamined rules, it inspires other parts to follow. Your goals no longer bend to convenience. Your ambitions no longer shrink to comfort. The inner voice that once whispered doubts now finds space to speak clearly, to say, I can, I must, I will. What was once intimidating, because it came from an imagined authority, becomes navigable because you see it for what it really is. An idea, not a limit. This is also the moment where responsibility returns to you. For so long, they carried the weight of defining what is possible. But once you question, you realize that responsibility was never theirs. It was yours all along. And that realization is not burdensome. It is liberating. The moment you accept it, life stops being something that happens to you and starts being something you actively shape. The fear of judgment diminishes because you are no longer obeying the judgment of a faceless authority. The fear of failure becomes a teacher, not a jailer, because you understand that every step forward is a step toward your own measure of success. And in this space, transformation begins, not overnight, not perfectly, but inevitably. The moment you question they, you have already changed. The movement toward your fullest potential is underway, and the longer you linger in that questioning, the more the old limits, fear, doubt, hesitation fade away. Because the truth is simple. Once you see that they was never really in control, you realize that only you can define the boundaries of your life. Once you have questioned they, and seen how its influence has shaped your life, the next, and most important, step is realizing that you are the one who must decide. The power to choose, the power to define your path, is not given by anyone else. It was never theirs to give. And yet, so many of us live as if our lives are pre-written, as if someone else has the final say in what we attempt, what we dream, or how far we go. The moment you internalize that all authority over your life ultimately belongs to you, is the moment real change begins. Choosing for yourself does not mean rejecting guidance or ignoring wisdom. It does not mean acting recklessly. It means evaluating every voice, every expectation, every warning, and asking a simple question. Does this serve me? Does this align with who I want to be? Once you do that consistently, you begin to notice a profound shift. Decisions that once felt heavy with obligation suddenly feel lighter because they are rooted in your own reasoning, your own values, and your own courage. You stop living according to someone else's timetable or definition of success, and you start living according to the standards you set for yourself. This shift transforms everything. Your priorities realign. The fears that once seemed insurmountable shrink under the weight of conscious choice. You start taking actions not to satisfy expectation, but to pursue purpose. Every step forward becomes an affirmation. You are no longer a passive participant in your own life. You are active, you are intentional, you are awake. And the freedom that comes from living this way is unlike any other. It is a deep, steady knowing that you are accountable to yourself first, and only then to the world. But this freedom is also responsibility. Choosing for yourself is not easy. It often means going against the current, taking paths others call risky, and being willing to face criticism, misunderstanding, or doubt. Yet, every challenge encountered in this space of conscious decision making is an opportunity to grow. You are learning to trust yourself, you are building resilience, you are proving again and again that your life does not belong to they, but to you. And the most profound part of this transformation is how it multiplies. Once you begin to choose deliberately, others around you feel the ripple. People start questioning the assumptions that held them back. The world may resist, criticize, or even mock, but your example quietly demonstrates a different way, a way of clarity, courage, and self-determination. What was once limited by expectation now becomes defined by vision, and vision becomes action. This is the essence of waking up, locking in, and changing everything. It is not a single dramatic event. It is a series of conscious choices, each one carving away the influence of they, each one building the life you were always capable of creating. The power was never external, it was always within, and once you claim that power, the rest of the world simply becomes the arena in which you act.